Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to another episode of Dad's Unlimited podcast. And today I'm really delighted to be joined by Professor Ben Hine. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining me today. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Ben Hine, Professor of Applied Psychology at the University of West London. And my research area kind of specializes in gendered experiences of abuse, which has led me to a space where I look at kind of post-separation abuse and abusive behaviors that occur in the context of family breakdown. And that has led me to the work that I've done with Dads Unlimited and various other organizations to specifically explore the experiences of men and fathers who are experiencing family breakdown and associated kind of abusive behavior. I also work in lots of different or operate in lots of different domains in terms of advocacy for men and boys. I'm involved with the Men and Boys Coalition, which I helped co-found, which is an organization or collective of organizations that seek to highlight and address issues affecting men and boys. Currently preparing the first kind of comprehensive book on current men and boys issues for Routledge. I'm chair of the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. I'm also a father of a boy and a girl, and I do a lot of volunteering in school, and I'm a parent governor, and a lot of my focus there is making sure that we focus on getting boys' reading attainment up and things like that. So yeah, interest across lots of different areas of my life.
Ben, there can't be a lot of time for hobbies.
Well, the hobby that I do have is that I am a Beaver Scout leader for my son's Scout troop. So I do that as well.
Fantastic. I have to say, you make me just feel extremely lazy with all that activity going on in your life. Absolutely wonderful. Okay, so obviously an extremely topical area. One of the things that I just think about as an outsider looking in is my perception is it's becoming more and more of a challenge. And I know it's a very wide area, but there seems to be more and more of a challenge around boys and young men. And obviously I'm thinking about knife crime in London, and I'm in Manchester, and we have a fair share of it here. Have you seen that? Do you see that continually growing as a problem for society?
I think it's really interesting when we have these discussions around masculinity and whether it's in so-called crisis. And I think there's this idea that potentially this is a new problem, but there's been lots of dialogue and discourse, particularly in academia, around whether masculinity is in crisis for decades and centuries. Similarly to some of the other kind of gender discussions that we've had. I think one of the things that's really starting to hopefully break through is the recognition that we can't just focus on one side of the debate when it comes to equality. And actually the message is starting to break through that actually men aren't just the problem, that they actually have problems that are worthy of our attention and also worthy of our empathy. And you named a very critical issue in terms of male on male homicide, knife crime, etc., gang violence. Now, those are all things that for a very long time within the debates that we've been having have been kind of couched as a problem that men present to us as a society, rather than a problem that men have, that we as a society have an obligation to help solve. And I think that's maybe potentially the shift that hopefully we're starting to see in the narrative, where we don't just look at, for example, the example you gave of gang violence and say, okay, well, that just proves that men are a problem. We need to then have a more constructive and higher level debate of saying, okay, well, why is this occurring? It's a problem for men, and that we can help, do something about that. And that's a similar shift that I hope we're seeing across all the different domains that we recognize that men and boys have issues within. For example, the education crisis, with boys falling behind in school and less men and boys going to higher education. In vulnerable populations, we have a prison population that's overwhelmingly male, and hopefully the discourse is changing, or I hope to change it away from, yeah, well, that's because men are X, to saying, well, okay, why is that the case? Why is the prison population overwhelmingly male? Similarly with the homeless population, etc., and really kind of foster this empathy. So I think a lot of the problems that we talk about have always been there. Hopefully we're starting to have some more constructive conversations about how we can actually deal with those rather than demonizing men and young boys.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And obviously the work that you're doing and the work that Dads Unlimited do is a really good example of that. And I guess hallelujah to that is all I can say because of the challenges it creates. So when you, on the reports, because you've done a lot of work around this stuff, on the report that you produced, did you just focus on fathers mainly in the report?
Yeah, so the project that we undertook, specifically the funded kind of focus was on fathers, and that was a result of numerous things. Both that it was the funders' interest, but also there is a valid reason to focus on fathers in terms of family breakdown, because previous literature shows that they're between 9 and 11 times more likely than women experiencing divorce to engage in suicide ideation. So there's clearly a gendered phenomenon there, which warranted the exploration of fathers. I would add that since then, I mean, I have done a lot of work, and in a lot of my previous work, I have looked at both mothers, fathers, men and women. I'm not just exclusively focused on men and fathers, although I was in that project. And actually a subsequent project that I ran looking at court involvement and parental alienation was with mothers and fathers. But yeah, this project was focusing on fathers for that reason, in that it seemed from the previous research that there was a really big justification for looking at fathers because of their mental health vulnerabilities, and that's exactly what we saw in the report when we completed it. So I think it was definitely a valid and worthwhile choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it, again, I keep saying this because I think it's probably important to point this out, that I, as a relative outsider, if you like, a general bystander of society, a
Yeah.
viewer of society, is it true what we perceive, what I perceive, that family breakdown has significantly increased? And if so, over what time period has it? A few questions all in here in one. Over what time period has that perceived breakdown in family occurred? And what do you think the key drivers are for that?
Wow, I mean, there's a lot of big questions
There is.
within that
There is.
bigger question.
There is, yeah.
You know, all we know is that at present, family breakdown is a really common occurrence. So, we're all familiar with the statistic of, the 50% statistic. So 50% of marriages end in divorce. That's the statistic in the UK. We know, for example, that in the UK, in any given 12-month period now, that there are around 110,000 divorce applications made, and that 50% of those involve children, and that 20% of those will involve a child under 5 years old. So we know, regardless of the kind of historical trajectories, which I don't have to hand, but broadly, yes, we know that divorce rates have increased over time, and that family breakdown is a more common occurrence now than it was, for example, 80, 90 years ago. And we know that there are a huge amount of couples and subsequently children experiencing that family breakdown dynamic every single year in the UK, and that is something that we need to look at and examine urgently, because we actually don't do it very well in the UK at all in terms of managing family breakdown and the stereotypes and the discourse we have around family breakdown. In terms of why those historical trajectories have occurred, I think it's really easy and sadly unfortunate that a lot of this debate sometimes gets hijacked by a kind of right-wing narrative of that it's because of wokeism, and it's because of the erosion of the nuclear family, and it's because of the institution of marriage being eroded, etc. I think, and what that's used as is a platform to kind of push back against really welcome and really necessary reforms around things like same-sex marriage, single parent families, etc. Because the reality is that family breakdown occurs for a whole variety of reasons. And actually, instead of focusing on some of those narratives, I think we could focus much more on the narrative of what it means to be a family, and that the constituent components of that family are hugely variable. I don't think anybody could describe what a traditional family looks like in the UK. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, in as much that, yes, it's good that we can embrace and we can support different family setups that are outside of a traditional heteronormative nuclear family. However, what I will say is that as a country and our institutions and our structures do not support family units in whatever form they take. And that is where we should be focusing our discourse and the issues, because we aren't laying the foundation for functioning, happy, well families at all. And that's not because we have drifted away from a nuclear family model. That is because no matter what makeup a family makes, we don't have those systems of support in place. So I've always been very clear to kind of separate my dialogue around what we need to do about families from this potentially kind of really hard line, we need to bring back nuclear family, etc., because it's not about that. It's about whatever unit, whatever the family unit looks like, we need to support them. And that, just my final comment, that actually has its foundations in attachment psychology, which is very, very clear that children look to people, doesn't have to be specific people, they look to people in their environment to keep them safe and to look after them. Doesn't really matter who those people are. So what we need to do is we need to support family units, whatever they look like, to support children. But yeah, it's definitely a big issue at the moment today.
So from your research and your observations, what would you say are the general experiences? Let's start with men, the guy in the divorce, if you like. What's the general experiences that you see as most common in the process?
Yeah, and I'll talk about this within the framework of a heteronormative model, because most of the families that I have worked with are a mother and a father, you know, separating. Of course, there are lots of different dynamics that are worthy of attention. But if we look at, you know, a man and a woman who have married and had children and then separated, the common trajectory, you know, that we discovered within our report was that actually, you know, there was a wide variety of why family breakdown occurred. There were lots of different stories there. So there was no kind of clear pattern as to why that happened, which, you know, is representative of the human experience and relationship dynamics. And there was also an even split between those who had experienced abuse within the relationship and those who hadn't as well. So again, variable there. But what we did see is that post-separation, there seemed to be a clear pattern for fathers, which is that they were the ones who overwhelmingly moved out of the family home. And that because of that, they fundamentally lost some element of contact with their children, which was not as dramatic for the mothers because they remained the resident parent. And a lot of those couples would then fall into a unequal pattern of contact and care. So overwhelmingly, it would be fathers that would be taking a minority share of care and mothers being taking the majority of care, falling into, you know, a 60-40. You know, that's actually quite a liberal estimate. Most people falling into a kind of 80-20 pattern. And that all of the men in my study, so we have to put limitations on the sample because, you know, the men that we spoke to were, there was 130 of them. But all of them were talking about, after separation, some form of post-separation abuse in the form of manipulation of contact. Some were very explicit, and it kind of spilled over into kind of what we would call parental alienation, so a specific attack on the relationship between the father and the child, and eroding that relationship. And some men presented, you know, actually quite a significant minority presented these extreme cases where they had left the relationship and that had resulted in a complete severance of contact with their children. And all of the men in the sample thus reported really negative, you know, impact on their mental health, their finances, their emotional well-being, their ability to work. It just adds up to this picture that when couples who have children separate, men follow a really, really negative and damaging trajectory. And that was echoed in the stats that we got from Dads Unlimited themselves, because we were able to review over 1,000 case files from men they supported. And out of those 1,000 cases, 40% said that they had experienced suicide ideation in the previous 12 months before coming to the service. So, you know, that's an extraordinary statistic. It really is extraordinary to think that out of the 1,000 men that are approaching for help with the service, 400 of them had experienced suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation in the last 12 months. And if you extrapolate that against the figures that we know of how many fathers there are experiencing family breakdown in the UK every year, my estimate puts that conservatively about 11,000 men every single year who are experiencing suicide ideation because of family breakdown. So it reveals some really, really worrying, really dramatic patterns that essentially amount to a hidden public health crisis within the UK.
It's very interesting, actually. And do you think that, I mean, obviously, our willingness and abilities to travel further to work as in the modern age is interesting. Do you find that you say that the guy very often is the one that leaves the matrimonial home, which makes absolute sense? Is there any indication or any evidence that shows that guys maybe go away further away to work now at all, so that creates more distance, whereas maybe in the past they might have split, but they might have stayed more relatively local to where the kids were? Or is that just not a thing?
I don't think it's something that we necessarily picked up in our study, so I wouldn't comment on it from that kind of perspective. I think, you know, I basically, I think it's very complicated, basically, where people end up after family breakdown. And what I do know is that a lot of the men in the study reported that one of the issues they faced was actually that the mother then chose to move and relocate further away, which placed a strain on contact because they then had to travel. So I actually would say in our study, the onus came through that it was relocation on behalf of the mother. But what I would say generally is that family breakdown presents a really, really big challenge, not only to a couple, but largely to men financially, because what we saw in the trajectory was that you have a family home that the couple has kind of constructed together, and when family breakdown occurs, men are the ones that are leaving the family home, and because of either traditional stereotypes about breadwinners and caregivers, or the practical elements of maybe it's the fathers that are still the ones that are working whilst the mothers are homemaking, because that is still quite a common dynamic even in this day and age. It was the kind of expectancy that the father would then have to move out and source a location for them to then pay and to live in, whilst also maintaining the family home. So, and I don't really know what the solution is there and what we do about that. All I know is that there was huge financial strain reported across the whole sample because of this having to maintain two domiciles, and that fell almost exclusively on the fathers. So there's a lot of kind of complicating factors basically in terms of relocating and geographical locations, and it can be a really complex dynamic as well, because if a partner then chooses to engage in a new relationship, they obviously then have new considerations within that relationship about where they live, and there might be that a new partner needs to move for work, and it does get very complicated. What we see is that sometimes we're not really equipping people to have those conversations very productively, and I think that's part of the problem. There's no support in place, and it can lead to some really messy situations.
Yeah, well, it is complex. I'm the first to acknowledge that it is very complex. And I guess you've also got the added elements of, like you mentioned there, you referred to new partners coming into the equation, which perhaps they don't really fully. People generally don't maybe think about that, that somebody else is going to come into the equation. And then I guess from a male point of view, the idea that a new male comes into the equation and the new male has access to the children, is there another level of complexity there, whereby there's the paranoia, almost probably statistically, that this person could bring harm to their children. I'm just not saying it doesn't happen, but statistically, I'd imagine it's relatively low. But I just wonder if that also adds just another dimension of stress and an upset to the whole equation.
Yeah, so new partners is really complicated, and even the language we use around that, calling them new partners, even that provokes tension and things like that. And we potentially need to look at more dialogue around, blended families, etc., things like that. I would hate to kind of through this debate reinforce this stereotype that there might be a because men are more abusive, that they come in and they present a threat, because actually we've seen lots of stories in the popular media of mothers both biological mothers and stepmothers who are equally potentially dangerous to children. So what I would say is that rather than moving away from that, I would look at the general challenges that blended families present. And it is very, very tricky because, you know, you have parents who, due to the legislation, have parental responsibility for a child. So if you're married and you have a child, or you put both parents on the birth certificate, they both have parental responsibility, and that maintains post-separation. Now, when you have a new partner coming in, that partner, if that couple isn't married, that partner doesn't actually have any parental responsibility for that child, but because of the dynamic in that they are potentially living with the mother or the father and therefore have access and interactions with the children, you're in this strange halfway house where they probably, you know, want to operate as a family, and the parent might seek their support in making decisions in relation to the child, but actually they don't have any legal responsibility to do so. So there are lots of challenges with new partners. And again, what I would focus us on is saying that we don't provide support and we don't equip people to have those conversations, and there's no real framework provided either in law or in the charity sector or anywhere that says this is what we need to be aiming towards, reorienting people on the safety of the children. But even that presents an issue, because one person's idea of good parenting practice is another person's idea of unsafe parenting practice. And when you have, say, for example, a father and a mother who, you know, they got married and they had children because they thought they were aligned, they've broken down for whatever reason, and then maybe one of those partners gets a new partner that has a different concept around parenting or discipline or, you know, etc. and things like that, they then might come into those conversations, and naturally I think that would put out the nose of the person who, you know, is then the biological parent. So it is extremely complex. And the interesting thing that we do see is that the narratives from some of the men in the study were that everything was kind of okay, even post-separation. And then as soon as a new partner was involved on their part, everything went, you know, nuts. And again, I would just focus us on, we're not supporting people to have those very complex and also very triggering, very hurtful, potentially, conversations, because it is extremely difficult to navigate those waters of your partner getting a new partner. And I think we're doing it too late as well. And I saw a wonderful quote at a conference I went to last year, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't quite remember it exactly, but it was, you know, there's no more it's no more difficult. Sorry, let me just get my words right. There are no two people where it's more difficult to get them to listen to each other than two people who once thought they could tell each other everything.
Wow.
And I think that really represents this idea that, you know, when you break down in a family with someone who potentially, you know, occupied that role as your person, the person you thought you were going to spend the rest of your life with, you know, that does represent a level of trauma that I think we underestimate. And I think that we don't help people navigate, because I think we kind of leave people to it. And I don't know if you've ever sat down with a divorcing couple and tried them to get to agree on anything. It's impossible. And that's because you're dealing with people that it's already kind of too late and they're in a position of hurt, and we need to do more about that. But anyway, that's my comments on new partners.
Yeah. I think it's a very, very, very good one. And I know I threw that one in just completely on the fly, but that's what I do. I'm terrible. But you know, I find it very, you know, I do find it very interesting. And you're right about what you mentioned at the start of that answer around stereotyping. And in a sense, I just proved the point, because I almost stereotyped even in the question. But it's true. One of the things that strikes me, I've had people who I've known very well who've said to me, particularly females, who've said to me, I didn't just lose my husband, I lost my best friend. And that is, I think that's quite poignant, actually. And that connects very much with what you just said there about once you were the best friend, as it were, and then suddenly you've got all these issues and problems, and you can't even talk, let alone be best friends.
Yeah. And I, you know, that it obviously depends on the context of the relationship, because
Yeah.
some people report that actually the breakdown was a positive experience in that they got distance from that person, because actually some relationships need to break down because they're not
Yeah.
functioning and they're not healthy. So
Yeah.
it does depend on the dynamic, but I do think you're right that if you have a positive relationship with someone that for whatever reason has then gone sour, you are dealing with really complex, hurtful trauma.
Yeah.
And you know, and the fact the breakdown itself will be re-triggering or triggering, you know, attachment issues that the person has, because you're dealing with issues of, you know, even if the person hasn't specifically violated trust in a way, you know, for example, with infidelity, there's still a real kind of attack and compromise to a person's understanding of someone they thought they were going to be with and they thought they were going to trust. When you look at kind of outcomes of that, actually, yes, you know, both partners report different kind of trauma and different kind of loss. And actually for men, we know that men are socialized to not really open up, to not discuss things with people, and they don't tend to have necessarily those really detailed, complex relationships that women potentially have with their friends. And so for men, when they lose their partner, they're also potentially losing the one person that they did actually talk to. And we see this manifest in lots of different statistics. So, for example, we know that men have huge issues with health after divorce because they haven't got the one person in their life telling them to go to the doctor and seek medical advice, which they had before, because we know that men are terrible at help seeking as well. So, you know, for men, particularly from what I've looked at and the literature, it really does represent this kind of cataclysmic loss across lots of different domains when they engage in family breakdown. And you know, ironically, a lot of the thing that men say would help them and would protect their mental health is contact with the children, and that's the thing they often lose the most. So it's just a really, really complex, complicated picture where we need to be providing everybody with more support.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And of course, now, Professor, I'm now going to ask you a very simple question. What's the solution to all this?
Yeah, very simple question. So,
Uh, yeah, I mean,
as,
obviously, I don't mean that literally. Obviously, I'm kidding.
yeah,
Yeah, what sort of actions can be taken?
yeah,
What sort of things are going on that can help to not necessarily resolve this, but make it
yeah.
better and easier for people?
Yeah, so it is a complex question, but actually there has been a lot of thinking, and actually in my report, you know, I thought a lot about this and was presenting recommendations. And
Mm,
there's basically different levels at which you can intervene, which represent different levels of difficulty. You know, if we're looking at, okay, what can we do in the immediate sense to help and alleviate some of these issues, there is some quite kind of what we might call low-hanging fruit that we could introduce there that would help people that are already in the situation. And then if you gravitate towards the other end of the spectrum, which is the much harder, you know, changing hearts and minds type of stuff, that it's equally necessary, but it's potentially harder to deliver. But if I just, you know, take us through that. So what we need to be doing in the immediate sense is we need to be supporting people who are experiencing family breakdown. And that involves, you know, things like community embedded support. It involves charities like Dads Unlimited actually getting the statutory funding that they potentially need and deserve from the government. The government should recognize that this is a core issue that affects millions of people every year. So we need some kind of community embedded automatic support that people can access that is state sponsored. Those are the models that we have in the Scandinavian countries, so in Finland and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, etc., that mean that when people, you know, are either in family breakdown or potentially right before it, they can go and they can seek help with a trained professional that is not there to stop the breakdown occurring, but is there to help manage the breakdown, keep people focused towards children, and help them to solve any issues that they might have or that are arising. So in the immediate sense, there is a very clear avenue of what we need to do and what we need to deliver. I think when you then gravitate through towards the other end of the spectrum, in terms of the kind of changing stereotypes, changing hearts and minds, and even, you know, roping in kind of legislative changes, we need to be fundamentally changing our ideas around how men and women operate within families. we need to be introducing policies that actually genuinely promote equity and not just say it, but don't actually deliver it. Because for me, I think there's a very clear cycle of how parenting inequality within relationships sows the seeds for acrimony post-relationship, because we're not giving, fathers and mothers equal access and equal time to their children within relationships. We're not giving equal maternity and paternity leave. Our shared parenting leave options are not working. And so you do get inequity and issues within relationships, that when the relationship breaks down, the father kind of says, well, I feel like I've been involved, but I've just been working and providing because I had to go back to work because there's no paternity leave. And the mother is potentially and validly bitter because they've had to do everything and they think that they're an absent father. So you get this dynamic, the seeds of which are often sowed within the relationship. So we need to do a lot of kind of changing our fundamental attitudes to parents, equality within relationships, legislation around contact and responsibility, and then kind of how we talk about separation in general as something that is worthy of our attention. So yeah, it's there's some things that are potentially easier to deliver and some things that are harder to deliver, but they're all important in changing this overall picture. But I really, what I would push against is this idea that we don't know what to do, because we do. It just takes the will to do it. And there are models, plenty of models in lots of different parts of the world, particularly in Scandinavia, but even in some, for example, US states are trialing this 50-50 presumption of shared care, which basically says, look, as a fundamental starting point, there should be 50-50 shared care of a child following breakdown. And it's proving wildly popular, and it's helping massively, keeping people out of family courts because there's nothing to fight about. In the UK, for example, there's no model for post-separation contact or shared care. It just says you both have responsibility, but figure it out yourselves. And that, I mean, like I said, get a divorcing couple in a room and try and get them to agree on something. It's very difficult. So yeah, lots to be done. Some easier, some harder.
Right. Well, that's fantastic. Well, thanks for that, Ben, and really, really enjoyed talking to you. And obviously, the work that you're doing, I think, is absolutely fantastic, desperately needed. The work that Dads Unlimited are doing and the other entities are absolutely vital. And we might not be able to completely fix it, but we can certainly maybe make it better. And I suppose ultimately maybe save a few lives on the journey in terms of a few less suicides.
Well, we will. That's the way I would actually pitch it to anybody who wants to actually listen about this issue, is that this is a suicide prevention issue, and Dads Unlimited operate as a suicide prevention charity. And that represents the kind of dramatic nature of the issue and why it's so urgent. And I completely agree. And what I would say as a final comment is we're starting from nothing. So anything we do is going to be better, because I think people really don't understand the lack of framework that we really have in this country around separation. So anything that we can do, easy all the way through to hard, is going to make things better, particularly for men who suffer with these suicidal thoughts.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, well, Professor Hine, thanks very much for joining me today. Really enjoyed talking to you, and lots of food for thought, including for me. I always say every single interview I do, and I do a lot over a year, I always get something from it. It makes me just think differently, or brings it, I suppose, to the fore of your mind. And this is no exception by any stretch.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, and I'm sure maybe at some point we'll maybe meet in London at some point.
Absolutely.
If I go past Watford on the M6.
Absolutely.
So thanks very much, Professor Hine. Thanks for joining me today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.